In this video, we are going to go over the basics of how to connect to a SQL database via the internet. So I'm going to first go into making a new Google Colab file. I'm going to call it assignment 06 SQL. Okay, and then I'm going to make a text header, and I'm going to call this text header database connection via internet. Now, we're not going to be connecting to a database via the internet for the module. However, when you're usually working for a company or out in corporate, this is normally the way that you would connect to a database via Python. So I thought it would be important just to show you how to do it. For some of you, this may be trivial, but if you do not have a technical background, this can be a kind of a hurdle for you to come over. So I just want to walk through the process of how to connect to an online SQL engine, so you can get the basics for how it works. Now, I am just going to copy in some credentials that we have, and I would like to thank DataCamp. I'm going to be connecting to their database, and we're just going to be doing a simple connection to DataCamp's database since they have an open public database. However, if you are interested in learning more about going into deep database connections, DataCamp has a lot of modules on this, and they cover this topic much more in depth. So I highly recommend that you go check them out if you're interested. So first, let's look at our credentials really quick. We have a host. Think of this as kind of, this will tell us where our database is. If you notice this is a URL. This is basically a URL. And this is very similar to an API in the sense that we are going to send this URL request out to a DNS server. That DNS server is then going to translate this URL request into an IP address. That IP address will then give us the port of wherever this database is at. So you kind of think about it like in some sense, we are plugging our computer into another computer, and we want to know where that computer is. So we give the DNS server this URL. That DNS server translates it to an IP address and gives the IP address back to us. So then we know which port out in the vast internet of things, which port to plug in our computer to, so we can send it, we can tell it information that we want to get. Next is the database. We want to be connecting to the census database, so we'll be specifying that. We also want the port. We are using a Postgres SQL, and we'll be connecting to a Postgres SQL engine in this video, so we'll be connecting to port 5432 so that it knows that it's a PostgreSQL connection, and our username will be student and our password will be datacamp. Now I'm going to run through two different ways to do this. I'm going to run through first just the endpoint way, which is the more, I guess it's the more basic way, not basic, but just it's more like you're just directly connecting to the port itself. And then I'm going to go through kind of the more modern engine way that you would do it, that you'd probably see more often. But first, I'm going to make a new section. I'm just going to call this endpoint because we'll be connecting via an endpoint. So first thing I want to do is I am going to enter a library that will allow us to connect to the SQL server. So I am going to enter SQL Alchemy. I'm going to import create engine. Then I'm also going to import pandas because we'll be using pandas data frames to run the queries. So I'm going to run this. And then I'll run this just to make sure that goes through. Then I'm going to create a new variable called endpoint. And I'm going to make that endpoint equal to, we're going to start off with Postgres SQL. And then that's telling it what type of, this is telling our create engine function what type of database we're connecting to, and then COPG2, which I believe is the engine. I'm not too certain about that. But so that will be the first parameter we want in our in this endpoint. Then we want to get our user. So we'll add our user into that. User. Okay, after our user, we'll then separate it by a colon and then enter the password. After we have the colon, we'll say where we're entering these credentials, and we're entering these credentials at our host. After that, we want to specify what port we're connecting to with our host, so we'll tell it the port. And then lastly, we want to give it a specific path to go to. So we'll tell the path that we want it to go to is the database. And that is our endpoint, if you want to see what that looks like. So this is the endpoint that we're going to. Essentially, we are passing in, let's see, these credentials at this host. This is going to translate to an IP address. So when we go to the DNS server, this is going to translate into an IP address and connect us to that computer. It's going to connect us on port 5432. That's the Postgres port. And then from there, we will give it the credentials of student as user, datacamp as the password. If it accepts those credentials, then we'll give it a request for a database. So now we can create our engine. I'm going to call this engine 1. And I'm going to make it equal to the engine create engine function we have, and we'll just pass this engine function an endpoint. And if we do that, I should be able to print out. Now, this should make a connection for us. I should be able to use the table names function to then show us all the names of the tables in this database. And as you can see, it was successful. Our engine was successful in connecting to the endpoint. And here is a list of all of the different tables that we have. I want to pull from the orders table. So what I'm going to go down here is I'm going to create a string called SQL, and I'm going to open it up with 3 quotes, and I'm going to close it with 3 quotes. And the reason why I'm doing this is when you pass 3 quotes into Python, it helps ignore any escape characters in the preceding text, so we don't have to worry about some SQL languages, for instance, have like quotation marks and things like that when you're selecting columns. So this helps us so we don't accidentally have any escape characters that bring us out of our string when we're writing our query. And I'm just going to create a very simple query. Remember, we are connecting to a Postgres database here, and because we're connecting to a Postgres database, we are going to be using PostgreSQL. Now, there's not much difference between the different SQLs from Postgres to MySQL to SQL Server. However, sometimes they do have a little bit different syntax, so just be aware of that. For this query, though, we're just going to do a simple select all statement from orders tables. Just to break down this query, for instance, this would work in MySQL SQL Server and Postgres, so it doesn't matter too much. But really quickly, just to break down the SQL, what's going on here. So this is a select statement, or actually, it's best, I think, to read SQL statements almost backwards, or at least that helps me a lot. So we're telling it from this table in the database, from the orders table, we want to select, and this star means all columns. So basically, we're sending out a query and we're telling it return all columns. So I'm going to save that string as our query, and then I'm going to use pandas read SQL function. And then I'm going to enter our query, and I'm going to then state which engine we are connecting to. And then if I go ahead and run that, you see that this returns a table. It returns the orders table for us from our SQL query. And if I did something like update this table, for instance, and I only wanted, say, region and rep, and I ran that, and I go back to our query here. Oops. Let's see. I might have spelled something wrong. Here we go. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay. So that's an example. In different SQL languages, some SQL languages might require you to have quotes, other SQL languages might not require you to have quotes. In this case, it was required to have quotes, so I got an error when I didn't have quotes. But you see, I update the SQL statement, and then it changes what is returned. So I can edit the SQL here, and that will return the query. Also, you don't need to be, I should have mentioned this earlier, you don't need to be typing all this down. This is just merely a demonstration for how to connect to a SQL, for a SQL database. I'm just going to change that back though to select star, and then I'm going to go down here and create a new section. I'm going to call this section standard engine. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to enter a different library. I'm going to import cop2. And if you noticed, if we go back up here, you see that we actually used that, we kind of used that library. No, we weren't using the library itself, but we're using the function here to be able to take in all this information. So what this library would do for us is it'll simply allow us to make a connection based off of the different information, based off of our credentials, so we don't have to create an endpoint. So I'm going to use connect, and then there's a couple parameters I'll need to fill. I'll need a host that'll be equal to something. I'll need a database that will also be equal to something, and I'll need a user, and that will be equal to something, and then I'll need a password, and that will be equal to something. And we already have these as variables, so it's really easy. If we go back up here, you see that we already have all these variables named that we need. So I can easily just go to host, I can go to database, I can just copy this over, user, oops, and a password. And that should make our connection there. And then if we want, we can do read SQL with pandas, and then we do our SQL query with our connection. you'll see that we are able to pull the same table. So this is just a different way of doing it. It's a different way of thinking about it. This is more standard, and when you're using a SQL application or an interface on your computer, this is usually the way that you'll end up you'll end up connecting to the SQL database. I'm just really quickly going to bring these credentials down for us though, so you can see kind of what's happening. Rather than using the variable names, I'm just going to replace them with the strings. So in this case, we didn't need to give it the port because this was able to determine it was a Postgres database. So we didn't necessarily need to enter that. But if I go ahead and run this, you can see that my connection still works with these parameters. So that is how you connect to a database via the internet in Python. Now I want to show you the exact same thing just with a SQL engine. So I'm going to go over here to dbeaver. I'm going to open up dbeaver, and then I am going to go to new database connection. And you can do this with just about any SQL engine that you have. I just happen to be using dbeaver. So I'm going to go to new, and it gives me a list of different databases. I know this can seem overwhelming, but all what this is basically asking is it's just giving you a list of the different types of databases that you might um, encounter or that you have options to connect to. In this case, we're using a Postgres SQL database. So I'm going to click on Postgres. I'm going to go to next. And you can see it already auto-populates the port number for us, 5432. If I did something like a MySQL database, however, I click on that, you'll see that I get a different port number, 3306, because MySQL has a different port than Postgres does. You can almost think of it as like you have your USB-C port for video, and then you have your HDMI port for video. Um, Both the ports can give you video. However, they have different port types, and if you try to plug an HDMI cable into a USB-C port, it's not going to work. And likewise, if you try to plug a USB-C cable into an HDMI cable, it's not going to work. So, same thing with these ports. So I'm going to go back to Postgres now, and you'll see it asks us for a host, a database, a username, and a password. So I'll go back to our code. I want to get our host, and then I'll copy that, put that in for our host. For our database, we want the census database, so I'm going to copy that in there. We already have the port. It wants our username, so I'm going to copy that into our username, and then I'm going to copy our password into password. And then now I'm going to click finish. And you can see that it is now trying to connect. And there you go. This is our database in a different form that might be a little bit easier to interact with. You can see it's a little bit easier to explore the different tables that we have. But if I go back to order and I go back to data, you see that I have the exact same data frame that I have here. And then if I want to, I can run a SQL statement. I can run a SQL query on it. I'm going to use select. We'll do region and rep. And then I want to select this from orders. I go ahead and run that. And there we go. I return region and rep. just like we did in Python. Um, Sometimes this is a lot easier. I personally, what I like to do is I like to play around with the SQL in an engine like this, and then once I have the SQL ready, I'll go back to Python and enter it in. Um, but yeah, so that is just an overview of how to connect to databases via the internet. You're not going to need to know how to do this for this module, but this is a very common, this is a very useful skill. If you are going to be ever connecting to a database in the real world, or in a corporate environment, this is most likely how you're going to do it. So it's good to know. Um, but that will be all for this video. Hope you enjoyed.